The Intergalactic Peace Summit of 2387 was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of bureaucratic theater. Held aboard the gleaming diplomatic station Nexus 7, it represented the galaxy's finest attempt at civilized discourse, which, considering the participants, was rather like watching a collection of particularly pretentious toddlers debate quantum mechanics while wearing their finest diapers. The station itself was a monument to architectural compromise, designed by committee to offend no one's aesthetic sensibilities and succeeding brilliantly at pleasing absolutely nobody. Its crystalline spires jutted at mathematically precise angles that somehow managed to look both imposing and ridiculous, while holographic banners displaying 47 different species symbols created a visual cacophony that would have made a carnival barker weep with envy. Inside the main assembly hall, delegates from across the galaxy had arranged themselves in what sociologists would later describe as aggressively passive seating arrangements. The Zephyrians, with their gossamer wings and superiority complexes, had positioned themselves at the highest tier, literally and figuratively looking down on everyone else. Below them, the crystalline Vorthak clustered in geometric formations that probably meant something profound in their culture, but looked suspiciously like they were playing interdimensional tic-tac-toe. The Kethmoran delegation, bipedal reptilians who had mastered faster-than-light travel roughly around the time Earth's ancestors were still figuring out fire, occupied the premium seats with the sort of casual arrogance that comes from having conquered 17 star systems before breakfast. Their scales glittered with embedded technology that served no purpose beyond making everyone else feel technologically inadequate, which was admittedly rather the point. And then there were the human. The human delegation consisted of exactly one individual, seated in what could charitably be described as the kids' table section of the assembly. She sat with the kind of relaxed posture that suggested either supreme confidence or complete indifference to the elaborate hierarchy surrounding her. Her plain military-style jacket looked positively primitive next to the shimmering robes, bioluminescent carapaces and quantum-threaded garments of her fellow delegate. The opening ceremonies had proceeded with the usual pomp and circumstance, which is to say with all the genuine emotion of a tax audit and twice the pretension. The Galactic Chancellor of Orthak, whose crystalline form refracted light in patterns that supposedly conveyed deep philosophical meaning, but mostly gave everyone headaches, had delivered the traditional welcome address in 17 different languages, none of which were actually spoken by anyone in attendance. It was during the preliminary introductions that things began to go sideways, though sideways suggested a mere deviation from plan rather than the complete diplomatic train wreck that was about to unfold. The trouble started when Ambassador Zilthak, of the Kethmoran Empire, a particularly pompous specimen even by Kethmoran standards, decided to exercise what his species considered wit. His reptilian features arranged themselves into what passed for a smile among his kind, though it looked more like he was contemplating which delegate might taste best with quantum season. "Before we proceed," Zilthak announced, his voice carrying the sort of authority that comes from never having been contradicted, "perhaps we should establish the credentials of our newer participants." His gaze settled on the human representative with all the subtlety of a supernova. After all, one cannot expect species that have barely mastered interplanetary travel to contribute meaningfully to discussions of galactic peace. A ripple of what passed for laughter among the assembled delegates filled the chamber. The Zephyrians twittered musically, their wings creating harmonious overtones that somehow managed to sound condescending. The Vorthak pulsed with synchronized light patterns that were either approval or an attempt to induce seizures. With their species it was often difficult to tell. The human representative remained seated, her expression unchanged. She might have been listening to a weather report for all the reaction she showed. "Indeed," chimed in Executor Veltar of the Hegemony, her forearms gesturing in patterns that her species used to emphasize points and occasionally to cast aspersions on other beings' genetic lineage. "What possible military experience could a species possess that has never faced true interstellar warfare? Their conflicts are limited to a single world, hardly the scope necessary to understand galactic strategy." More approving sounds echoed through the chamber. Several delegates actually applauded, which in some cases involved tentacles, in others required specialized appendages, and in one memorable instance consisted of controlled bioluminescent explosion. The Chancellor, either oblivious to the growing tension or perhaps secretly enjoying it, gestured with one crystalline appendage toward the human. "Perhaps our colleague from Earth would care to enlighten us about her military background." "We are," naturally most curious about the extent of human martial experience. The question hung in the air like a bad smell at a diplomatic dinner party. The chamber fell into the sort of silence that precedes either profound wisdom or spectacular disaster. And given the track record of most peace summits, the smart money was on disaster. The human delegate finally moved, leaning back slightly in her chair. When she spoke, her voice carried across the chamber with perfect clarity, unenhanced by the translation matrices and quantum amplifiers that most species required for effective communication. She asked, and there was something in her tone that should have served as a warning to anyone with functioning survival instincts. Unfortunately, the assembled delegates had spent so many centuries considering themselves the apex of galactic civilization that their collective survival instincts had atrophied to roughly the level of particularly overconfident lemming. "Oh yes," Zilthak practically purred, his reptilian features arranged in what he clearly believed was a devastating smile. "We are most eager to learn what military experience Earth has to offer." The human looked around the chamber, taking in the expectant faces, the barely concealed smirks, and the general atmosphere of barely restrained condescension. She nodded once, as if reaching some internal decision. Then, with movements that were neither hurried nor hesitant, she began rolling up her left sleeve. The fabric pulled back slowly, revealing skin that had seen considerably more than anyone in the chamber had expected. But it was what lay beneath that sleeve, what years of experience had etched into flesh and memory, that would fundamentally reshape every assumption the galaxy's most civilized species had made about the newcomers from Earth. The chamber remained silent, though the quality of that silence was beginning to change. Where moments before it had been anticipatory and smugly superior, something else was creeping in, a growing awareness that perhaps, just perhaps, they had made a rather significant miscalculation. The human finished rolling up her sleeve, and looked up at the assembled delegates with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the entire exchange. What they saw would haunt the nightmares of several species for generations to come. What the assembled delegates saw carved into the human's forearm was not merely a scar. It was a topographical map of violence, a three-dimensional testament to the sort of brutality that their advanced civilizations had theoretically evolved beyond. The mark ran from just below her elbow to her wrist, a twisted canyon of healed tissue that spoke of metal meeting flesh in ways that medical scanners would classify as catastrophically inadvisable. But it was the intricate nature of the scarring that made even the most battle-hardened delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the clean surgical precision of energy weapons or the neat circular burns of plasma discharge. This was something far more primitive, consequently far more disturbing. The jagged, irregular pattern that spoke of shrapnel, of explosions survived at distances that should have been fatal, of medical treatment performed under conditions where sterile surgical environment was a luxury reserved for people who weren't currently being shot at. The Zephyrians, whose gossamer wings had been fluttering with barely suppressed mirth moments before, suddenly found their aerial displays becoming noticeably more subdued. Their species had fought their last war using elegant beam weapons from orbit, settling disputes with the sort of civilized detachment that allowed them to maintain their sense of cultural superiority, while vaporizing their enemies from a safe distance. Executor Veltar's four arms, which had been gesturing dismissively throughout the earlier proceedings, now hung motionless at her sides. Her species had mastered warfare through strategic deployment of automated battle platforms, mechanical extensions of their will that kept the actual violence at a comfortable remove from their person. The concept of carrying permanent physical reminders of combat was both alien and deeply unsettling. The human delegate seemed entirely unconscious of the effect she was having on the assembly. She examined the scar with the sort of casual interest one might show when checking the time, as if the twisted landscape of damaged tissue was merely another piece of equipment that required periodic inspection. She said, tracing one finger along the length of the mark with the sort of familiarity that suggested she had performed this gesture countless times before. "This is from Kandahar." IED went off about 15 meters away, caught some fragment. Her tone suggested she was discussing the weather, rather than an explosive device designed specifically to turn human beings into their constituent atoms. Several delegates performed their species' equivalent of swallowing hard. The concept of an improvised explosive device was troubling enough. The idea that someone would cobble together instruments of destruction from household materials spoke to a level of creative violence that most galactic civilizations had legislated out of existence millennia ago. But the casual way she discussed surviving such an encounter suggested a familiarity with violence that made their own military histories seem rather like elaborate board game. Ambassador Zilthek's reptilian features had lost their earlier smugness, though years of diplomatic training allowed him to maintain some semblance of composure. "Kandahar?" he inquired, his translator matrix working overtime to find equivalent concepts in his language. This was some sort of military installation. The human's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she found his question either amusing or pitiful. "Afghanistan, third tour. We were providing security for a medical convoy when the Taliban decided to object to our presence." She paused, considering her words. Objected rather emphatically. As it turned out, the chamber's silence had evolved again, progressing from anticipatory smugness through uncomfortable awareness to something approaching genuine concern. The assembled delegates were beginning to realize that their assumptions about human military experience might have been somewhat optimistic. The Vorthek delegation pulsed with synchronized light patterns that their translators identified as confused inquiry mixed with growing alarm. Their species had achieved interstellar dominance through superior technology and strategic thinking, conquering worlds through economic pressure and technological superiority. The concept of face-to-face combat, in primitive conditions, was as foreign to them as quantum physics would be to a particularly dim-witted houseplant. Talib executor Veltar ventured, her voice carrying the sort of careful neutrality that diplomats employed when they suspected they were about to learn something unpleasant. "Another Earth nation, I presume?" The human's laugh was brief and entirely without humor. "Not exactly. More like, well, imagine if your most fundamentalist religious extremists decided that the best way to achieve spiritual enlightenment was through strategic application of explosives and automatic weapons." She gestured vaguely with her scarred arm. "Then give them 40 years of practice and a deep personal grudge against anyone who doesn't share their particular interpretation of divine will." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. Several species exchanged glances that their respective cultures would interpret as, "We may have made a significant error in judgment." The Cathmoran delegation, in particular, appeared to be reconsidering their earlier assessment of human military capability. "But surely," Ambassador Zilthek said, his voice carrying the desperate tone of someone trying to maintain a worldview in the face of contradictory evidence, "this was an isolated conflict, a minor dispute between factions." The human tilted her head slightly, as if considering how to explain a concept that should have been obvious to anyone with basic pattern recognition skills. "Well, there was Iraq, and Somalia, Bosnia, Kuwait. Vietnam lasted about 20 years, give or take." She paused thoughtfully. "Korea's technically still ongoing, though we call it a ceasefire these days." Each name fell into the chamber's silence like stones dropped into a still pond, creating ripples of unease that spread through the assembled delegates. The concept of multiple simultaneous conflicts was troubling enough, but the casual way she listed them suggested a species with an almost pathological tendency toward organized violence. 20 years? One of the Zephyrian delegates whispered, their musical voice carrying overtones of disbelief. Their last military engagement had lasted precisely 14 hours, had been conducted entirely through remote-controlled platforms, and had resulted in a total of 3 casualties, all of whom had been immediately resurrected through advanced medical technology. Vietnam was complicated, the human said, as if this explained everything. The others were shorter. Iraq was only about 8 years the second time around. The first time was quicker. Just took us 4 days to dismantle their entire military infrastructure. She spoke with the sort of matter-of-fact precision that military personnel used when discussing operational parameters, but her words hit the chamber like physical blows. The Cathmoran Empire's most recent conquest had required 6 months of careful planning, diplomatic maneuvering and strategic economic pressure before a single shot had been fired. The idea that an entire military could be dismantled in less than a week spoke to capabilities that their intelligence assessments had clearly failed to anticipate. The human seemed to notice the effect her words were having on the assembly, though her expression remained neutral. If anything, she appeared mildly puzzled by their reaction,
as if their discomfort was somehow unexpected. "You did ask about my military record," she pointed out reasonably. "Though I should mention, this scar isn't from fighting aliens." Her finger traced the length of the mark again, and somehow that simple gesture had become infinitely more ominous. "This is from fighting other humans." The implications of that statement settled over the chamber like a toxic cloud, and several delegates began to suspect that their understanding of human civilization might need some rather substantial revision.
The revelation that humans had inflicted such damage upon themselves hung in the chamber's atmosphere like a particularly toxic gas leak. The assembled delegates sat in stunned silence, their various appendages, wing and crystalline formations, all conspicuously motionless, as they processed this information through their respective neural networks, quantum consciousness matrices, and whatever passed for brains among species that had convinced themselves they were the pinnacle of galactic evolution. The human delegate, seemingly oblivious to the existential crisis she had just triggered among the galaxy's finest diplomatic minds, continued her explanation with the sort of casual precision that suggested she had given similar briefings before. "The thing about human warfare," she said, settling back in her chair with the comfortable air of someone launching into a familiar topic, "is that we've had quite a lot of practice. Roughly 5,000 years of recorded history, and we've been at war for about 95% of it." Ambassador Zilthek's reptilian features had arranged themselves into an expression that his species typically reserved for contemplating their own mortality. 95%, he repeated, his voice carrying the sort of careful neutrality that diplomats employed when they suspected they were about to receive very bad news. "Give or take," the human replied with a shrug that somehow managed to be both dismissive and terrifying. "We've had maybe 300 years of actual peace scattered throughout our entire civilization. The rest of the time, someone somewhere on our planet was actively trying to kill someone else with whatever weapons they could lay their hands on." The Zephyrian delegation had begun unconsciously clustering together, their gossamer wings creating a defensive formation that their species hadn't used since their homeworld's predator elimination programs had concluded several millennia ago. Their last war had been fought with elegant precision from orbital platforms, lasted exactly 47 hours, and had been concluded with a formal surrender ceremony featuring catered refreshments and a string quartet. "But surely," Executor Veltar interjected, her forearms performing the complex gesture patterns that her species used to ward off unpleasant thoughts. "These were primitive conflicts, simple territorial disputes resolved through crude weapons." The human's expression suggested she found this question either endearing or monumentally naive. "Well, by the 20th century we had developed chemical weapons that could kill everything within a 50-kilometer radius, biological agents that could wipe out entire continents, nuclear weapons capable of rendering planets uninhabitable for thousands of years." She paused thoughtfully. "We used all of them, of course. Not the planet killers were not completely insane, but everything else was fair game." Several delegates performed their species' equivalent of choking. The concept of chemical and biological warfare was horrifying enough to civilizations that had spent millennia developing increasingly humane methods of conflict resolution. But the casual mention of weapons capable of planetary devastation suggested a species with a relationship to violence that existed somewhere beyond the bounds of rational thought. "You actually used weapons of mass destruction," one of the Vorthek delegates pulsed, their crystalline form flickering with light patterns that their translators identified as profound moral distress mixed with morbid fascination. "Ended a war that had been going on for 6 years, and had killed roughly 70 million people." She noticed the delegates' collective recoil and added helpfully, "That was just one war, mind you. We call it World War II because we'd already had one World War about 20 years. That one only killed about 20 million people, though the exact numbers are disputed." The silence that followed this revelation was so complete that several species began checking their auditory equipment to ensure they hadn't suffered mechanical failure. The concept of warfare on such a scale was beyond their comprehension, not because they lacked the imagination, but because their respective civilizations had evolved past the point where such conflicts were even theoretically possible. Ambassador Zilthek's voice, when he finally found it, emerged as barely more than a whisper. 70 million casualties, in a single conflict. "Oh, that's just deaths," the human clarified with the sort of helpful precision that made her audience wish she had been less thorough. "Total casualties were considerably higher when you factor in wounded, displaced populations, civilian infrastructure damage, and long-term environmental effects. We were quite efficient by that point. Mechanized warfare, strategic bombing, industrial-scale logistics really brought human conflict into the modern era. The Cathmoran delegation had begun unconsciously arranging themselves into defensive positions, despite the fact that their species hadn't faced a legitimate military threat in over 2,000 years. Their most recent territorial expansion had involved a politely worded request, followed by a brief economic incentive package. The target species had actually thanked them for the conquest. This mechanized warfare, Executor Veltar ventured, though her voice suggested she wasn't entirely certain she wanted to know the answer. You developed specialized military technology for these conflicts. The human nodded enthusiastically, apparently mistaking their horrified fascination for genuine interest. Tanks, fighter aircraft, submarines, artillery pieces, capable of hitting targets 50 kilometers away. We got quite creative with delivery systems. Rockets, guided missiles, satellite-controlled precision munitions. By the end of the 20th century, we could hit any target on the planet within 30 minutes of deciding to destroy it. Any target, a Zephyrian delegate whispered. Any target, the human confirmed. We had weapons that could penetrate 60 meters of reinforced concrete, others that could destroy entire city blocks with a single projectile. Cluster munitions that released hundreds of smaller explosives across several square kilometers. Thermobaric weapons that could collapse underground bunker systems through controlled atmospheric pressure waves. Each technical specification landed in the chamber like a physical blow. The assembled delegates were beginning to realize that their carefully maintained image of humans as primitive newcomers might require some rather fundamental revision. These weren't the crude weapons of a species barely capable of interplanetary travel. These were the refined instruments of a civilization that had spent millennia perfecting the art of destroying itself. But certainly, the Vorthak Chancellor managed, their crystalline form pulsing with desperately hopeful light patterns. Your species eventually evolved beyond such primitive approaches to conflict resolution. The human's laugh was brief and entirely without humor. Well, we did develop more efficient methods. Cyber warfare, economic manipulation, psychological operations, targeted assassination programs. Drone strikes controlled from thousands of kilometers away. She gestured casually with her scarred arm. Though we never really abandoned the old-fashioned approaches, sometimes you still need someone on the ground with a rifle and the willingness to use it. The chamber had grown so quiet that the various life support systems became audible. The subtle hum of air recyclers, the gentle pulse of gravity generators, the barely perceptible vibration of the station's massive engine. These sounds, normally lost beneath the chatter of diplomatic discourse, now seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. All of this, Ambassador Zilthak said slowly, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to process information that fundamentally challenged his understanding of reality, represents your species' approach to resolving disputes among yourselves. Among ourselves with ourselves. Occasionally despite ourselves. The human confirmed. We fought wars over territory, resources, religious beliefs, political ideologies, trade routes, succession disputes, ethnic differences, and sometimes just because we were bored and the other side looked like they might put up an interesting fight. Several delegates began exhibiting the physical symptoms their respective species associated with acute stress responses. The Zephyrians had unconsciously synchronized their wing movements into defensive patterns. The Vorthak were pulsing with increasingly rapid light sequences. The Cathmoran delegation had arranged themselves into a formation that anthropologists would later identify as preparation for immediate retreat. You fought wars, Executor Veltar said faintly, because you were bored. The human considered this question with the sort of academic interest that suggested she had given the matter serious thought. Not primarily, but it was definitely a contributing factor in several conflicts. Humans have a tendency toward restlessness when things get too peaceful. We start looking around for problems to solve, and if we can't find any legitimate problems, we have a remarkable talent for creating new ones. The implications of this statement settled over the assembly like a blanket of existential dread. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had spent millennia developing increasingly sophisticated methods of avoiding conflict, creating elaborate diplomatic protocols and economic interdependencies specifically designed to make warfare impractical.
The idea that a species might actively seek out opportunities for violence was so alien to their worldview that several delegates began wondering if their translation matrices were malfunctioning. How many wars? The Vorthak chancellor asked, their crystalline form now pulsing with the sort of morbid curiosity that accompanies complete psychological breakdown. Has your species fought in total? The human tilted her head thoughtfully, as if accessing some vast internal database of human military history. Define war, she said finally. Are we talking about formal declarations of hostilities between nation-states, or do we include civil wars, regional conflicts, colonial uprisings, proxy wars, police actions, and what we euphemistically call peacekeeping operation? The question hung in the air like a sword, and every delegate in the chamber suddenly realized that their understanding of human civilization was about to undergo another catastrophic revision. The human delegates' request for clarification hung in the chamber like a particularly ominous storm cloud, and the assembled representatives of galactic civilization suddenly found themselves in the uncomfortable position of people who had asked a simple question and were about to receive an answer that would fundamentally alter their understanding of reality. All of it, Ambassador Zilthak said hoarsely, his reptilian voice barely above a whisper. Every conflict your species has ever engaged in. The human's expression took on the sort of distant look that mathematicians wore when contemplating particularly complex equations. Well, if we're being comprehensive about it, she said slowly, historians estimate somewhere between 14 and 15,000 distinct military conflicts since we started keeping records. That's not counting tribal skirmishes, clan disputes, or what we call police actions. Those would probably triple the number. The figure hit the chamber like a physical force. Several delegates performed their species equivalent of stumbling, despite being seated. 15,000 wars. The entire galactic community had experienced perhaps 30 significant conflicts in the past 10 millennia, most of which had been resolved through economic pressure or carefully worded diplomatic protest. 15,000, Executor Veltar repeated, her forearms trembling with what could charitably be described as existential shock. 15,000 separate wars, give or take a few hundred, the human confirmed with the sort of casual precision that suggested she was discussing weather patterns, rather than the systematic destruction of civilization. The record-keeping gets a bit spotty during the Dark Ages, and there's some debate about whether certain colonial uprisings qualify as full-scale conflicts, or just enthusiastic disagreement. The Vorthak delegation had begun pulsing with light patterns that their translators couldn't even identify. Apparently their language lacked adequate concepts for the emotional state they were experiencing. Their entire species had fought exactly 3 wars in their recorded history, all of which had been concluded through negotiated settlements, after minimal casualty. But surely the Zephyrian representative managed, their melodious voice now carrying overtones of desperate hope. These conflicts became less frequent as your civilization advanced, as you developed more sophisticated methods of dispute resolution. The human's laugh was brief and entirely without malice, but it carried implications that made several delegates wish they had never asked the question. The 20th century alone saw over 40 major wars, and we managed to kill more people in that 100-year span than in the previous 1,000 years combined. Technological advancement turned out to be something of a force multiplier when it came to creative destruction. She rolled her sleeve back down with movements that seemed almost ritualistic, covering the scar that had started this entire diplomatic catastrophe. The thing you need to understand about humans, she continued, her voice taking on the sort of patient tone usually reserved for explaining complex concepts to particularly slow children, is that we're not naturally peaceful. We don't fight wars in spite of our civilization, we fight wars because of it. Conflict is what drives us forward. The chamber had become so silent that the background hum of the station's system seemed deafeningly loud. The assembled representatives of 47 different species sat in stunned contemplation of a truth that challenged every assumption they had made about the nature of intelligent life. Every major technological advancement in human history, the human continued relentlessly, came from military research. Computers, satellites, the internet, nuclear power, rocket technology, medical advances, all of it grew out of our attempts to kill each other more efficiently. We literally innovated our way to the stars on the back of weapons research. Ambassador Zelthek's voice emerged as barely more than a croak. You reached space through military technology. Our first rockets were ballistic missiles. The human confirmed matter of fact. We figured out how to leave the planet by developing delivery systems for nuclear weapons. The same technology that put our first satellites in orbit was originally designed to drop thermonuclear warheads on distant continents. The implications of this revelation rippled through the chamber like shockwaves. Every species present had achieved spaceflight through peaceful scientific endeavors, curiosity-driven exploration, resource surveying, or simple wanderlust. The concept that a civilization might literally fight its way to the stars was so alien that several translators began displaying error messages. So when you joined the galactic community, the Vorthak Chancellor pulsed weakly. You brought with you 5,000 years of continuous warfare experience, technological innovation driven by military necessity, and a cultural framework that views conflict as a natural state of existence. Pretty much, the human agreed cheerfully, though we prefer to think of it as being really good at solving problems through applied violence and creative destruction. The silence that followed this statement was so profound that it seemed to have physical weight. Then, slowly, something remarkable began to happen. The seating arrangements, those carefully maintained hierarchies of galactic prestige and power, began to shift. The Zephyrians descended from their lofty perch. The Kethmoran delegation edged their chairs slightly closer to the human representative. Even the crystalline Vorthak began pulsing with what their translators identified as respectful acknowledgement, mixed with healthy survival instinct. The Galactic Chancellor's voice, when it finally emerged, carried none of its earlier pompous authority. Perhaps, he suggested with the sort of diplomatic delicacy usually reserved for diffusing explosive situations, we should discuss the terms of Earth's integration into the galactic community in detail, with generous accommodation for human, cultural perspective. The human delegate smiled for the first time since the session began, and somehow that expression was more unsettling than anything she had said. I think that would be very wise, she agreed. After all, we're still learning how to be civilized. As the session moved into recess, the galaxy's most advanced civilizations found themselves confronting an uncomfortable truth. They had just discovered what actual civilization looked like, and it was far more terrifying than anything they had ever imagined.